Absolutely.
And Tony Perazzo, our sponsor from Grant Thornton, the West Coast Managing Partner, has joined us. We always like to have him be here with us.
How are you today?
Hey, Tony.
Oh, hey, Tony, there you are.
Krista Steele, another one of our board members. She just joined a new board. Krista, what's your new board? Your new board?
Brain tip. Brain tip.
Great.
Yay!
Congratulations.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Hello.
Well, we'll let people keep joining here. It looks like we've still got some people coming on, but I just wanted to say hello. I'm Lisa Spivey, the executive director of the chapter, and I first went to China in 1978, spent much of my professional career there in Asia. And one thing that I could say is the more we know about China, the more we know we need to learn. And so I'm so pleased that we're doing this program today. I'm going to pass it over to Kim Box, who is our chair, and she will moderate the program and kick it off. Thanks,
Right.
Kim.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. I too have done many a business in China in my executive career, and as well as here onshore with manufacturing over in China. So I was really thrilled to see this come up as a topic for directors. I think you'll find this panel to be diverse and insightful on things that are going to be really critical for us as directors to be considered. Whether your board does business with China or not, I think that we all know that it's very important that we're astute on the economics of what's happening around the world. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Harry in just a minute. I do want to let everyone know each of the panel members are going to introduce themselves and then give their perspective on what's happening with business in China, and then we are going to go after the three of them have had a chance to give a short talk, five or so minutes. Then we are going to open it up, and we're really looking forward to a very interactive dialogue, hearing other experiences and answering questions. So if you think of a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and then when the speakers are done, we'll start fielding questions and really look forward to it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first. Oh, and I also wanted to thank Grant Thornton, and Tony's here on the phone with us. Thank you for your support and sponsorship of this program. Grant Thornton is always just a wonderful partner for NACD. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harry Broadman, and he will introduce himself and kick off the first topic of discussion.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm delighted that Lisa asked me to join. We've been trying to do something together now for a couple of years. So this is great that we can do it virtually and save greenhouse gases and money. Perfect. So I chair the emerging markets practice at Berkeley Research Group, which is a global economic litigation dispute firm and also a business strategy firm. We've got 22 offices around the world, including in Shanghai and in Beijing and other parts of Southeast Asia. My own work at BRG focuses on complex cross-border disputes in investment and trade, arbitration, antitrust and competition policy, corporate governance issues, and compliance, particularly with respect to the FCPA and UK Bribery Act. So all of it is quite international. And a growing portion of my practice, as you will not be surprised, is CFIUS, on which I sat when I was in the White House. So Mr. Trump has been very good for me in many respects in my business with respect to CFIUS, but generally with respect to investment disputes. My clients tend to be C-suites and boards, so I'm quite used to speaking to directors, and I think the way that I met Lisa was on the faculty at an NECD master workshop a couple of years ago. Also, my clients are law firms, and other types of investment funds. In my spare time, I'm on the faculty at Hopkins and write a monthly column for Forbes, and a pretty frequent column also for the FT, all of which tends to focus on emerging markets issues. And I guess you've seen from the bio, prior to my current positions, I was in the private equity industry for a while, management consulting, and spent time in the White House as a trade negotiator, negotiating the creation of the WTO and NAFTA, and also in the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and then prior to that at various think tanks and academia. Lisa was just telling us that she first set foot in China in '78. I didn't get to China intensively until the late 1980s. And that was during my role at the World Bank, where I was in charge of the bank's state-owned enterprise restructuring operational program, which were basically loans to restructure the SOEs, but also put in place corporate governance reform measures. This was antecedent to the state asset management program that ultimately I was the lead advisor for the bank in China on. So I spent a lot of time in SOEs throughout the country, more than I can count and more than I care to remember. But I know that when I was at the bank, I had a map of China on my wall in my office, and I put black dots in all the cities that I've been in China. And my Chinese friends would come to me and say, "Oh my God, we've never been to some of these cities. What were you doing there?" I said, "Well, I was going through some factory floors at SOEs," and that gave a chuckle. And then that turned into an entire emerging markets fascination with me, and I've worked in about 85 emerging markets across 5 continents. So those make good comparators to China, and China makes a good comparator to those other countries. I'm going to kick it off in terms of the substance, and I'm going to make 5 points very quickly, and I hope they're not intended to be, but I hope they're nonetheless provocative. The first point that I'll make is China is in a secular decline in growth, and although we might see cyclical ups, I believe that China is on a downward path of growth. And it's not because China is a mature economy. It's because the state-owned enterprise, state-owned bank nexus has a stranglehold on the economy, and reforming those entities and system is not going to come unless there's a change away from the Communist Party in control, which I don't think is going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. But I think my first point is the secular slowdown is not because of a maturation in the Chinese economy. It's because the state-owned enterprises are the raison d'etre of the Communist Party. I think the second point is, despite the fact that the leadership really is trying to shift the economy away from an export-led economy to a consumption-oriented economy, it has not been terribly successful in doing so. In fact, the latest data that just came out a couple of days ago, China's share of global exports, in fact, has increased. But if you look at, for instance, if you compare China and the United States in terms of how important consumption is as a percentage of GDP, in the US, and you hear this on the news when every time the CPI comes out or other indicators come out, consumption accounts for 2/3 of our GDP. Private consumption. In China, it accounts for 1/3 of GDP. I think that shift is going to be very difficult to do, again, for the reason I stated in my first point about the Communist Party. Nonetheless, I think the more that US firms can help prop up the consumption side of the economy, I think there is a lot of money to be made there. And frankly, it is the more competitive fringe of the economy than the hard and heavy industry sectors where the SOEs are more prominent. The third point I would make is that despite the fact that China acceded to the WTO in 2001, and I was a little bit of part of that process, they are in broad violation of their accession agreement to the WTO. It's a legal agreement. And the legal agreement spells out a number of reforms that China promised to make. They have not done probably the lion's share of them. I don't know how many of you like to read these things, but if you look at the accession agreement and do a checklist about what, as you know, China, what have they done, you'll see that it's been woefully inadequate. Now, that raises the issue, okay, so what should be done? And I think the issue is that many countries are affronted by China's trade practices, and yet their firms, frankly, tell them not to rock the boat, and they don't want to rock the boat because they're making money in China nonetheless. But that is exactly the problem that China has been enjoying, is that there has not been any kind of collective action on the part of other major trading partners to say, listen, we either need to renegotiate your accession to the WTO, or you can leave the WTO. And I know that may sound outlandish, but I fervently believe that China should have whatever economy it wants. Absolutely. If they want to have a communist party, I think that's fine. But they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't get all the benefits of being a WTO member if they're not going to adhere to the agreement. And I think we need to have an adult conversation about this. I think this is a very difficult thing to do. But I think one of the problems that our president has done, frankly, has been to take on China bilaterally and not in a collective action. And I think the Chinese, frankly, love that approach. And we'll see whether in the future we can have a more collective approach with respect to China, because I think then all would win if they acceded to the WTO. The fourth point that I would make is my work with corporations and investment funds in China has focused on what I call the China 2.0 strategy, which is, given that I think China is not going to continue to grow in a secular manner, look into the ASEAN. And that is the China 2.0 strategy, where labor costs are not as high, their trading relationship is quite well honed, and it's quite a well functioning trading relationship, and it's a very large market. So my prediction is that increasingly is going to be where China ends up losing competitively, perhaps in the medium run to countries in the ASEAN. And then I think the last point I made, and it really dovetails onto that point about ASEAN, is this question of decoupling. I think the notion of US forced decoupling, where the government can mandate or tries to mandate US firms to come home, is quite a fanciful idea. We know that firms will move out of China if it's not competitive, and they'll move perhaps to the ASEAN, or they'll move to other countries where it is more cost effective, or gets around any kind of tariff walls. But the issue for, I think, our country is to try not to waste a lot of policy time and, frankly, energy in trying to mandate that multinationals come back to the United States. I just don't think that's going to go anywhere. In contrast, the Chinese, because of the way they run their economy with the Communist Party, they can mandate decoupling, to be sure. And in fact, my most recent Forbes column looks at some of the new data that came out of CFIUS just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if you look at those CFIUS data, you will see that the Chinese have begun to retrench through beginning in 2019 in a serious way in terms of making certain kinds of investments in the United States. It's something like 30% decrease. I don't know the number right off the top of my head, but I think decoupling for China is certainly going to happen, and I think that there are consequences for US firms doing business. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to put those 5 issues on the table. Thank you. And now I will introduce Warren Clark. And Warren also is an old China hand. And Warren, I'll let you introduce yourself and give some thoughts.
Great, thanks, Harry. Very interesting discussion there. It's really an honor for me to join today's discussion. I recently completed a 3rd-year assignment as our firm's US resident partner in Asia, which was my 3rd assignment of working in China. I was based in Shanghai, where I helped manage our global global client relationships, and I provided technical support to our teams who are auditing subsidiaries of US-based clients and also Chinese companies that are listed on US stock exchanges. As of about a week ago, I'm now an audit partner in our Southern California practice, and I lead our National China Business Group. From when I first lived and worked in China as a professional it's been 25 years ago, the country has experienced an amazing transformation. The risks and rewards of doing business in China have also changed. Now, as an auditor, I'm trained to focus on the risks rather than rewards. So I thought today that I would touch on a few risks that I see in the current environment. And the first is managing from afar. Many companies are struggling to return their expatriate management teams to China. Yesterday, the US State Department eased the travel advisory from do not travel to reconsider travel, and that was due to what they called improved conditions. Nonetheless, getting a new visa, finding a flight or a charter flight at any price is a real challenge. And upon arrival, most are welcomed by a mandatory quarantine of 14 days locked in a hotel room. And if for whatever reason you need to leave China, you get the pleasure of going through the whole process again when you want to return. So you're pretty much stuck in the country. It's always been a challenge to find and identify qualified people who are willing to live and work in China and who are successful at doing so. And given the current conditions on the ground, it's even more difficult. Some companies are responding by relying heavily on their local management to replace the expatriates. And these folks might feel undue pressure to deliver similar results as their predecessors. And such pressure could result in unwanted behaviors and possibly consequences. So the challenge is to maintain a global corporate culture, maintain relationships with suppliers and customers, and to also ensure compliance with the company's policies and procedures. That's challenging anyway, but trying to do it from 5,000 miles away is really difficult. And that's a challenge and a risk that many of our clients are facing. Harry mentioned a little bit about China no longer being a low-cost provider, and that's what I see as the second risk. For several years now, manufacturers in China have faced rising costs, tariffs, and other challenges resulting from the political environment. The pandemic has just accelerated the reassessment of global supply chains. I think AmCham and Curl probably talk to this a bit more, but they recently had a study or a survey that came out saying that U.S. companies are not leaving China, and I agree that there's no reason to abandon the China market. The local market is just simply too attractive. Many companies, however, are considering what is termed a China +1 or +2 strategy of adding or shifting capacity outside of China, and in many cases closer to their customers. Interestingly, Chinese companies are also affected by these same factors, and they too are assessing the value of expanding beyond China. And while I agree that many of them are moving to Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries, they are also looking at opportunities in the US. And once the pandemic is resolved and travel bans lifted and life is back to normal, I expect that many Chinese companies will look to invest in the US, with the caveat if they're allowed to do so, or if they're in an industry that would allow them to operate here. And that's for two reasons. One is to be closer to their customers, and second is to diversify their holdings. Now, messaging at the federal level seems to be that Chinese investors are not warmly welcomed in the US. However, state and local governments are usually very welcoming to any investment that creates jobs. And in the current environment, we're seeing less competition for state and local incentives that are used to attract foreign investment. Some of the options for responding to potential Chinese investment in the US, one would be to let it happen, and the US company would leverage their embedded presence here and their advanced technology to keep the competition at bay. I would just warn, though, that China is committed to leading what they call the fourth industrial revolution of disruptive technological innovation. And they're very investing heavily in, from a government perspective, in artificial intelligence, big data, biotech. And it's their intention and plan that they would be able to catch up and even pass what the US has done. Another alternative would be to collaborate and cooperate with the Chinese investor that was interested in the US market. And perhaps a company here could help them access the US market in exchange for help to access the China market for the US company. And the third alternative would be sell your business at an attractive price. If they're interested in acquiring a business, and if the price is right, you can sell. But I would also keep the door open to buying the company back if the price became attractive, if the Chinese company was unable to properly manage it here. And that's about all I had for today for time, but we're running on time. But I just wanted to, one final point, for those of you who sit on an audit committee, a fair question to your auditor is, given the current environment, how as an auditor are you responding to the challenges of auditing in China? And that's a great question to ask your auditor. And as an auditor, we're receiving that question, not only from our clients, but also from our regulators, because it is an issue for them as well. And so look forward to additional discussion here today, and I'll turn it over to Kerr for his thoughts.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks, Warren, and thank you, Harry. Yeah, you guys have brought up some really good points. I mean, one of the advantages of going last is, you know, I can just refer to what the previous speakers said and just say, yeah, that what they said, but hopefully I can add a little bit of color on some of the points that they brought up. I mean, I think localization, the consumer market, tech innovation, and also structure of businesses, those are all really great topics. And, you know, maybe I can give a little bit of color on that. First, it's very much a pleasure and an honor to be here with this group. This is my first exposure to NACD, and I've been hearing about the group, and I'm eager to engage. I looked at the list of attendees, and it's actually very interesting. I see a lot of familiar names there. In fact, a lot of names that are actually part of our membership. So that's great. I know many of you sit on the boards of companies that are members of the American Chamber of Commerce. A quick snapshot on the chamber here in Shanghai, because it might be a little bit different from chambers domestically that you're accustomed to working with. I'll just give you a quick snapshot. We're about 3,000 members, which includes probably most of the Fortune 500. We pretty much cover all sectors. We've got about 22 industry committees, so that covers the gamut from automotive, healthcare. Those are probably the two biggest here in Shanghai. Those are key industries for us. One of the fastest growing actually is education. Education for profit. Most of the international schools are members of the American Chamber. We consider them businesses, which they are. They are businesses, and they're growing fast and quite profitable actually. It also covers financial sector. Shanghai being very much a financial center. You know, most of the banks and insurance companies are members of the chamber. Quick snapshot, just go a little bit deeper on the chamber itself. Most of our members have been in China for more than 10 years. Also, we are a chamber of American companies, but most of the people who actually show up at our events are Chinese. So I mentioned both of those points because, you know, the American Chamber over here is not really just, you know, a little oasis of Americanism and all about market entry. It's much deeper than that, much different from that. So, and again, Warren touched on this whole localization thing, which I think is a key point in terms of how businesses are being run over here. The chamber itself, we have a staff of about 50 people, annual budget of $5 million, and we put on about 400 events per year. A big part of what we do, I was glad to have Harry on the call, former USTR and from the White House. The local government connectivity is very much core to what we do at the chamber on both sides. We we have, deep interaction with the Chinese government. And then also I visit Washington, D.C. about twice a year if I can, this year obviously being a little bit different. And in Washington, we engage with the White House, USTR, State Department, Commerce, and then we also talk fairly actively to people on the Hill. Just personal background, I'm from San Francisco. Most of my career, I came over to China. My first touch here was in the mid 80s. So I've also sort of seen the evolution of China, the various different iterations of China, and it really has changed quite rapidly. Most of my career is basically between Silicon Valley and Asia. So I've been based here in Shanghai for about the last 17 years, and that's where I'm sitting now. Quick thoughts on the sort of doing business with China theme, and I'll just touch on a few things and so that we can really go deeper into discussion. And I won't focus really on the operational side of this. My sense for this group is we're really interested in, this group would be interested in more of the strategic questions having to do with, should you be in China at all? And if so, how should you be in China? And I think Warren, touched on some of that, some of these structural questions about, owning an equity position in your competitor as opposed to trying to go head to head with a local player that, may have advantages that you will not and never will have. So I think that's actually a key point right there. Fundamentally, most of our members, why are they in China? It's very much, not about manufacturing anymore. We still do have some manufacturing companies in our membership, but it's very much what we call, for the bumper sticker phrase, sort of in China for China, is meaning producing goods and services within the China market for the China market. And that really extends into, having fundamental R&D and product development within this market that's intended to serve the market. And that's very much reflects the majority of our members, how they're structured. And to speak to a point that came up, in terms of, well, I guess everybody's talking about this whole decoupling thing, and the president also often mentions, wanting to bring American companies back from China. And I think it was Harry that mentioned, yeah, that's not happening. Our latest survey came up, we asked directly, of our members, are you planning to leave the China market? 92% said we have absolutely no plan to do that. And really the remaining is there's some SMEs that are certainly going to pull out of this market, or, not necessarily by choice, but because of the COVID situation, meaning they didn't have the balance sheet to sustain. So you're seeing some churn in there, and you're seeing some churn on the supply chain side, meaning restructuring, and I think it was Harry or Warren that mentioned sort of the China Plus One strategy. We're definitely seeing that on the supply chain side. So the whole sort of made in China for re-export is very much an old model. Having said that, Apple is probably the most public contrary to that trend. They do manufacture in China for re-export, right? Most of the iPhones are made here. But we want to be clear, what's the reason for that? I mean, it's not about cheap labor. Manufacturing in 2020, right? It's manufacturing per se is not necessarily about labor at all. But here it's more about the ecosystem itself. When we see electronics companies like Apple, the infrastructure ecosystem over here is just so well developed that a lot of those companies are really in no position to be moving. So when we ask our members, and also we ask what's the view on the China market from the headquarters perspective, the majority of our members say that the headquarters views the China market itself as being not necessarily a presence in the country, but really looking at the China market as indispensable. So that's not going away. The majority of them say it's either the number one growth market globally, or number 2 or 3. Couple other notes. I guess I should just update you on the COVID situation here and just kind of impact. I think, Harry mentioned, growth, secular growth going forward. COVID, I mean, yeah, the view from the ground here is actually quite positive. China market was sort of first in and first out. What you see on the ground here today is some fairly deliberate defensive measures in terms of contact tracing, mask wearing, management of the prevention for a phase 2 kind of thing. Regarding the visas, that's something the American Chamber is very much actively involved in terms of getting the expats to get back into China. China right now, they are starting to widen the aperture in terms of allowing more business travel. The part of that is not so much because the COVID is being controlled outside China better, because it's more about competence level of being able to control it within China. In other words, there have been some outbreaks here, but they've demonstrated that through extremely sophisticated contact tracing, they're able to keep those outbreaks very limited. Impact on 2020 revenues for sure. Good and bad. I mean, 78% of our members said they do see a negative impact on 2020 revenues due to COVID. No surprise there. The surprise is probably on the other side where, some of the businesses actually had a positive impact of COVID. And what we're talking about there is mostly the logistics companies that had a PPE bump early in the year. But overall, the 2020 revenue picture probably won't be that bad for China, again, as a function of them being able to come out of the COVID both quickly and fairly smoothly. It was a fairly well-managed process. Just a couple things to end on. Again, sort of just to throw out a few topics for you to think about in terms of, as you think about China at the board level, what to listen for, or, reasons that would lead to success or failure here in the China market. Just kind of three things real quickly to just throw them out as topics. Speed is probably the number one issue in terms of competitiveness between multinationals and their domestic counterparts. Speed of decision-making, speed to market, speed to adapt. And part of that is structural, right? The multinationals are at a disadvantage because by definition, the large strategic decisions all go back to headquarters. And that necessarily means, at least a one-day turnaround in terms of decision-making, and that can be very frustrating for local managers. The other thing, you've got sort of a conundrum here that I'm sure Warren would appreciate, because, China is still, you mentioned audit and risk management. I mean, China is still, what we like affectionately call a low trust environment. It's hard to get people that you truly trust. And so you've got that. You've got the need to empower local decision-making on the one hand in order to achieve China's speed. And then on the other hand, you've got, a trust issue with local management, and it is hard. We have an expression over here in China. We say, when you go looking for a CFO, you've got to find a CFO that you trust as much as you trust your own mother. And if you can't find that person, then hire your mother. So that's kind of a thing. I don't know if you guys say that in the audit world, Warren, but second, and it's related to speed, is digital. That's another competitive disadvantage that we have as multinationals over here, is that the local companies have adopted digital technologies so much more quickly. And again, I'm from Silicon Valley. I can appreciate, how quickly, the first early adopters, but when you look at comparatively here in China, the speed with which they've gone and embraced e-commerce, delivery, electronic payments, all of those kinds of things, the customer management experience via WeChat and other social media, it's quite extraordinary. And I think that in and of itself is probably a good reason to be in the China market, just to be able to feel that speed. Last thing just to look for at the board level as you evaluate your businesses and their approach to China. I think alignment with local government. I think it's really hard to have that sense coming from the United States, where government plays a very different role than they do here. I mean, here in China, the government actually plays almost a deal-making kind of function, and so again, at the board level, you'd want to be sure that that your local business here is aligned properly with what the goals are for the government. And again, you know, we can get into this in discussion because Carrie brought up this idea of the SOEs and the role of the CCP, and you know, I don't disagree with that, but it's a question of you need to be aligned with their plans, otherwise the business it'll be a tough slog heading uphill. So I'll leave it there. A lot of these topics are related to each other, and so I think they come back to a healthy discussion. I'm eager to hear what other people on the call have to say about China and what kind of questions and comments come up. So thanks. Back over to you, Kim.
Okay, thanks, Kerr. And we have a very timely question based on your most recent comments around trust. Ted Hack, if you want to unmute and ask your question about cyber risk.
Hi, thanks very much for all the comments, guys. I'm on a small biotech in Europe that has Asian investors, Japan, Hong Kong, China. So yeah, depending how you want to slice and dice Hong Kong versus China these days. My question is just, what are your thoughts on the level of candor that people are able to have with Hong Kong and Chinese investors about things like cybersecurity, what I think could broadly be called government oversight, et cetera. And it sort of plugs into some of the headquarters comments that were made earlier.
Is that one for me or for Warren? I guess both of us. Well, actually, all three of us.
Any of you, yeah.
Carrie's a lawyer.
All thoughts welcome.
I guess I'll take a quick stab at it. I'm not sure what you mean by candor, but I think is your main concern just over the level of IP protection per se? And if that's the case, I would say, you know, directionally, you know, IP protection here, they do have a different perspective on IP and these kinds of things. But I think IP is one of those things you've never really completely achieved it. I would say directionally, China has been heading in a positive direction in terms of implementing IP protection. So there's less of a concern than there has been. Having said that, our survey results do say that yes, it's a different environment here with respect to IP, and probably maybe more importantly, the value of judgments when one does sue. Looking at the probability of a positive judgment, foreign companies versus domestic companies, that gap has been closing. There's still a gap, meaning just statistically, a slight disadvantage to the foreign companies. But what we hear most complaints about is the lack of a meaningful judgment at the other end of it. I do hear complaints of, I can't name names, but I do hear complaints about, even in the arbitration system, you know, they show up to arbitration and realize that 2 out of the 3 judges in the arbitration have a clear vested interest. And so, yeah, you do still hear those kinds of things. So net, I guess I'd be curious if the other speakers have a perspective, but net, I'd say directionally good, but still not an environment that you could put on par with Europe and Europe and the United States. I don't know, is that fair?
Yeah, that's in the vein I was looking for. I would actually broaden it to, I'll say, information security beyond just IP. And again, I come from a large pharmaceutical background where offices get raided, laptops get confiscated. And so as a board, talking about information security in I'll say, the broader sense of how can you discuss such things in order that you protect yourself and your information.
Yeah,
and I'm an audit chair, so I think Warren would also have some comments there.
Yeah, that'd be great to hear from Warren.
No, let's be clear. Yeah, let's hear from Warren, but let's be clear. I mean, this is a very different political and economic system. No question about it, but let's hear from the other speakers.
Yeah, I would just echo what Kerr said. I think that it certainly is a different environment, and the concept of ownership and of IP, and that it doesn't need to be shared outside of the organization it might even be cultural, but it doesn't have the same legal meaning as it would in the U.S. environment. And I think there's also I think there's also a concern about the IP protection and your IT security of your information that's even resident in the US. Because you hear about the Russian hackers, but there's also the Chinese hackers that are actively trying to infiltrate your US systems. Right? So you need, you don't have to be operating in China to have your IP taken. And I think that the US companies or any company should have the necessary protocols in place to protect their IP, regardless of where that IP sits.
Okay. And Harry, do you have any other comments before we move on? There's a couple questions here.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So Melinda Franklin had a question around U.S. government's positions on WeChat and TikTok. Melinda, do you want to elaborate, and then we'll see what the group has to say?
Sure. Well, when Kerr and I spoke a couple weeks ago, that was certainly top of mind. I just wanted to get an update on, obviously we all saw the Oracle TikTok potential partnership yesterday. What's going on with WeChat and TikTok? Because I know they are both significant companies in China, and how does that affect overall U.S.-China relations?
Are you looking for how those companies are responding in China, or what's going to happen in the current controversy?
I would say the latter.
Okay, so I'm quite close to this. I think we have a very unique situation, extraordinarily unique situation, where you have two executive orders that have been issued. One, the first that came out from the president, was on banning the operations of TikTok in the United States. The second one, to order a divestiture. And that divestiture order came out of the CFIUS process, which was a pretty studied investigation over the last 8 months that came out of on the heels of the Grindr decision and so forth. You have quite a public conversation with the president talking about certain suitors, which is again highly unusual, at least during my days in CFIUS. And then you have the Chinese, who obviously have then amended their export control regime, quite directed at AI and web-related information, which is clearly pinpointed at TikTok. So even if there was to be a divestiture, which the Oracle, as we understand it, the Oracle proposal is not for a divestiture at all. There's no change in ownership of assets. But if there were, the Chinese then would mandate, well, you need to come to us for a license in order to sell that. So in my book, I think the Chinese, frankly, have outsmarted the U.S. in this particular matter. Now, the negotiations are ongoing. It's an extraordinarily complex negotiation with multi-parties around the table, in quotes. If I were Oracle, I'd be very nervous, because I think the policy risks on both sides of the ocean are quite paramount. And now the most recent reports in the press are, gee, why was it Oracle chosen? And the closeness of the president. I put that aside. My role is to sort of look at these in a clinical perspective, and I just think this is not going to clear up anytime soon, unless something's going on that I don't know. But if experience is any guide, I just don't see this shaking out in an orderly fashion, particularly with the election coming up, and the Chinese know that Mr. Trump is under pressure to try to win.
Great.
Do you want me to add anything to that, Kim, or?
If you have any other comments, we had a couple different questions, but yeah, give your thoughts too. That'd be great.
Yeah, we've been frantic over this last 45 days. We've been, I think the word apoplectic may actually apply here. There's two different things. Harry was focusing more on the TikTok side of it, which is an interesting issue itself. And I think you brought up an interesting point. In this whole dance, yeah, I do think that the Chinese are quite clever in sort of taking a chapter out of the CFIUS book and saying, two can play this game. And what's remarkable to me, in terms of observing China and the U.S. for the last 30, 35 years, is it's incredible how similar our two governments seem to be converging on similar strategies for different purposes and from different perspectives, but they seem to be behaving more and more the same. Harry covered the TikTok side. To us, the WeChat side is the one that's most alarming, and it would be an absolute game-changing, devastating blow to us if the executive order is implemented globally, meaning it impacts the China market. So if you can just, and sorry, Melinda, you asked the question, but you know all this stuff well. And it's not really addressing your question is what's going to happen before Saturday? And the answer to that part, Melinda, I'm sorry, I don't know. We're in daily conversations with the administration. Unfortunately, we can no longer do that through the ambassador since he's leaving his post. But we think the key players here are actually Peter Navarro, which is interesting because it's fundamentally not necessarily a trade issue. It's fundamentally, and again, to lean on some of the stuff Harry mentioned, the CFIUS, but it's also a lot about IEPA. IEPA is the legislation that they're leaning on more on the WeChat side. So it has to be both. The president is declaring this a national emergency, a national security issue, and an emergency, meaning there's exigent circumstances having to do with why he needs to prevent American companies from taking WeChat. And again, it's just would be devastating to us. If you can imagine if you are Kentucky Fried Chicken or Starbucks or Nike. Nike is a good example because if you wake up in the morning and the president has said you can no longer take WeChat Pay, well, 9 out of 10 people who walk into your store are going to be paying for their goods via WeChat. So why is that a good thing if you're Nike? If you're Nike, suddenly you just can't take money for your shoes. You've got Adidas right next door. It's a German company. They have no issues. So we've got a problem. We're watching this closely. I think the short answer to your question, Melinda, is we don't know. We've delivered our talking points to the administration so far, crickets. We've heard nothing in terms of what they're planning to do. So we don't know.
We have another question.
Kim, if you don't mind, let me just make a quick addition here. I think many, particularly related to WeChat, I think many people in the US just don't understand how important WeChat is in the Chinese economy and in society. I mean, almost all communication is done via WeChat. I mean, most of my colleagues in China do not communicate with me via email. It's done via, here when I'm in the US, it's done via WeChat. Even when I'm in China, it's done via WeChat. All of your your transactions, buying things from somebody off the street to buying a television or something, it's all done with WeChat. So if, as a foreigner, not being able to use that tool would really impair our ability to operate effectively in the China environment. I would, on the opposite side of that, I would just add that, you know, Instagram and Facebook and those tools that are used in the US are not available in China. And so, you know, if I can't use Instagram in China, why should I be able to use WeChat in the US? And I think that I know there's other implications to it, but there's kind of a tit for tat idea of those tools, those US tools aren't available there. So why should the Chinese tools be available here?
Okay, great. We have a different question. Jack Lazar has a question around the acquisition of ARM. Jack, would you like to pose your question?
Sure, it's actually kind of a two-part question. This ARM's being acquired by NVIDIA. It seems like that's a difficult putt to see get done in China. And I think it would be interesting to get your guys' feel for that. And I guess the corollary to this is any thoughts you might have with the escalations that have been going on, and semiconductors have obviously been at kind of the forefront of all of this. I'm very fearful that TSMC is a flashpoint for war. And I'd just like to get your guys' thoughts on that too.
Kim, who goes first? That's a hot potato.
Whoever has the urge to go first.
I don't have an urge to go first, but I think you're right. I mean, I guess I'll make two comments on it. I share your concern around the TSMC thing, and when I saw that the TSMC deal in Arizona, and I see more and more restrictions placed on companies via this entities list, I do see that as a potential flashpoint for war. If you think about it from the Chinese perspective, they see Taiwan as sort of occupied territory by the United States. I mean, that's how they view it. I'm not saying one side's right or wrong. I'm not going to get into that here, but we have a very different perspective there, and that's a dangerous game that's being played right now. I think also taking the Chinese, I think we all know that the sort of the U.S. view on this with respect to Huawei and the semiconductors generally, but just to share the Chinese side of this, they're confused. They're hearing, on the one hand, they're hearing the United States like, oh, you're not buying enough of our stuff, right? And so from China's side, they're saying, okay, well, what stuff do you have to sell us? Well, we've got semiconductors, right? I think that's the it's either semiconductors or airplanes are the number one and number two exports that the United States has, and this is what makes up what closes the gap in the trade deficits. On the other hand, then the Chinese look at it and say, and they look at Huawei and say, oh, what's the problem there? Oh, you're buying too much of our stuff. You're buying too much of our technology. So there are two sides to this. And I guess that's a long way of saying we haven't seen the end of it. Don't know specifically how the ARM transaction is going to take place. China does have cards to play here, in terms of blocking these global M&A, on antitrust grounds. So they do have cards to play here. I haven't really heard anything one way or the other as to whether China is going to make a move here. In general, though, my perspective is that China has been fairly restrained in terms of, not that the ARM transaction is a tit for tat pattern, but they've been fairly restrained in terms of what actions they've taken. I think the TikTok thing was something where they were really required, or they felt a requirement to take a defensive position or retaliatory position. So that was an interesting move. Don't know whether they'll do the same on the ARM.
I should add that I was on the board of Mellanox, which took 413 days to close because of China. So I've seen it escalate over the last year and a half, and I think this ARM situation is actually going to be an interesting one. If anybody else has any other thoughts, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah. Do you think that they've been relatively fair in blocking M&A? Like the deals that they've blocked, I guess you got a vested interest there, because I assume you wanted that deal to go through in less than 400 days.
There was no anti-competitive issue here. This was simply just getting high-speed connectivity, high-speed IOs tied up by a U.S. company, right? And they don't want U.S. to have control of anything. So I mean, honestly, I didn't know whether it was going to close or not with Mellanox. I think ARM's a much bigger issue because everybody uses ARM. So that's why I'm kind of curious.
It is.
I mean, I would just, recall one example, I think a pretty well-known example of Coca-Cola trying to buy a medium-sized juice company. This was occurring when I was a business partner with Madeleine Albright, and Coca-Cola was our client. And I kept telling them they're going to use the competition law, not because there's a competitive issue, but because they're not interested, frankly, in having a U.S. company buying this juice company. And Coca-Cola, frankly, said, no, they're going to stick to the law. This is, they're going to, and we're clean. We don't have a competition problem. And you know the outcome. So I think, to me, the lesson is that the Chinese are very smart. They're very clever. They're very large. They also are playing smartly to the rest of the world. Particularly other emerging markets, but some advanced countries who, frankly, are not behaving quite like the U.S. has behaved. And just on that last point, I think I would add, something has changed dynamically in the way that the U.S. is perceived, and frankly, the way that U.S. decisions with respect to China are made, and that is the Congress, regardless of party, in the United States pays much more attention to China in a micromanaging way than ever was the case before. Now, I used to work in the Hill. Some of my best friends work in the Hill. But boy, once you get the Congress involved in making these kinds of decisions, it becomes really problematic. And so I think it's really a hornet's nest that has been woven. And in that regard, if you look at the FIRMA, which is the new law that undergirds CFIUS, there's tremendous buy-in by the Congress on the writing of that law, which was very different from the days that I sat on CFIUS. So I think that dynamic is also important to recognize. So when they say the U.S. now is a much more complex set of characters than it was just frankly 3 years ago. And it's
So Harry, let me ask you a question on that, if you don't mind. As a U.S. company, if that decision-making or influence is in Washington, how does a U.S. company respond to that? Do you put in your own people in Washington to try to help influence the decisions that are being made there, or do you have the ability to do that, or what else can you do?
Well, I think most of the big U.S. companies who are active in China have a pretty significant presence here in Washington, where I am. I think most of them who are smart have realized that their clients are, apart from the targets, I should say, is not just the executive branch anymore, but it's the Hill, right? You had Senator Hawley yesterday, calling for, this TikTok deal is crazy. Why should this thing go forward? That's an extraordinary movement. Now, it's one thing to have a senator or congressperson make a request for an investigation, but where they enunciate a policy position, and I'm sure this has befuddled the Chinese, and they think, oh my God, who's in control there? So yes, I think the companies have to pay attention to what's going on the Hill as well as what's going on in the executive branch. And right now, the White House, as Keir mentioned, I know Navarro personally. He's, this is a guy, I'm not sure what he's doing, but it's not trade, that's for sure.
We have another question I want to get to, and then we can circle back some more on those topics. Liza, you had a question about the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Can you go ahead and elaborate? And then we'll see what the panel has to say.
Sure. Thank you for a great presentation. Hi, Kirk. Good seeing you here.
Hi, Lisa.
This question is mostly for Warren, but also for the other two panelists as well. As you all know, Senate passed the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act in May. The House actually passed a similar version buried in the Defense Budget Act in July. And it does look like there's quite a bit of backing on this. And for context, the act literally is trying to kick a lot of public companies that don't have the capability of having PCAOB audit or inspect the auditors of that particular company off the U.S. stock exchange, and even potentially off the pink sheets and other trading capabilities in the U.S. Now, the focus of that legislation is very much Chinese companies, but in fact, a lot of multinationals have huge operations and huge revenues from China, which requires them to literally have a lot of audit backup paperwork in China. And under those circumstances, they're kind of caught betwixt and between. As far as I can tell, there has not been a lot of details as to what exactly is happening for the non-Chinese company. And I was wondering, Warren, in your kind of day job, shall we say, what are multinationals doing to prepare for this? And what has been the conversation so far as to, look, let's not do this in a very broad strokes where you have unintended consequences. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I've been living and breathing this issue since the PCAOB was formed back almost 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And it's been an issue ever since then. Right? So it's not so much what the companies can do, it's what are the auditors doing, right? Because the issue here is that the PCAOB, which regulates the auditors, are unable to inspect the work papers of the Chinese accounting firms. And for those of you, I'm sure this audience is familiar with the way that the accounting firms are structured, but in any large network, the member firm in China is not owned, it doesn't share an ownership structure with the US firm. So example, in our case, I'm a partner in the US firm, and I share in the profits and hopefully profits of the US firm. But our China firm is completely, although they are in our network, they are in an independent firm. And that's structured for many different reasons. There's risk and legal obligation issues. There's also regulatory issues in China to get a license to be an auditor there. And for all those reasons. Now, our member firms are registered with the PCAOB, and they have a license to do that work in China, to do audit work in compliance with PCAOB standards and to issue reports that are accepted by the PCAOB. However, the PCAOB is not allowed to inspect in China like they are in almost every other country in the world. So some of the things that the accounting firms are doing, and again, I think this Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act is targeted towards the Chinese accounting firms that are auditing the Chinese companies that are listed on the US exchanges. Mm-hmm. I think it's very carefully worded to avoid any issues that are related to US companies that have operations in China. Now, of course, if you are a significant subsidiary in China and your financial information is consolidated into the US group, then that information is subject to inspection in the US. Now, those work papers do not come to the US, but the work that the US team does to get comfortable with the audit work that's done in China on that subsidiary is available to the inspectors in the US. And the onus is really on the US group auditor to get comfortable with the work that's done in China and to convince the regulators that they've done enough to get comfortable with it. And that was my job, right? When I was in China, my primary responsibility was to ensure that the audit work being performed in China was compliant with PCAOB standards, and that our group audit teams in the US could rely upon that work. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And
thank you.
So Rob, you had another question around the US keeps adding Chinese companies on the entity list. Do you want to elaborate on your question?
Yeah, so it kind of circles back to a little bit brought up just before with ARM and TSMC. So yes, the US is being much more aggressive in putting especially technology companies on the entity list, forcing them to stop buying semiconductors, CAD equipment, even semiconductor equipment. So, you know, what impact are we seeing on that on Chinese companies? You know, Huawei being the biggest one. There's a bunch of other small ones as well. And more keep getting added. Now there's a threat to put SMIC on there. I know China has a big initiative to become a global semiconductor power. And you know, SMIC is their foundry hope. So, you know, what impact are we seeing short term on the impact to these companies on the entity list? And what do you think will be happening longer term?
Again, is that me? I'll take a stab at it. And actually, I think these two were my answer to these two. The two questions would be related. I think there's a problem here in terms of messaging and really explaining from the US side exactly what is the end game here, what's the end result that we're looking for. Is it that we're just trying to bring Huawei to its knees, or is there you know, and is it just a sort of a retaliatory thing, or is it a specific, you know, clear and present danger that Huawei presents to our telecommunications infrastructure that we're trying to prevent, or is there a larger goal here? And I think there's a lot of frustration on this side, both in the US business community and among, you know, our friends and neighbors in the Chinese community of a lack of a clear picture as exactly what is the issue, what does the United States want to achieve with this. And I think both this issue, the semiconductor thing, as well as the thing that Lisa brought up, which was the delisting of Chinese firms on US capital markets. You know, what are we trying to achieve? So in other words, what's being lost here is the points that were brought up by the speakers, which is it's really about reciprocity or lack thereof in terms of the audit papers. And that's the issue. But instead of that being front and center, it's actually being, the way it's being communicated or miscommunicated is that it's sort of retaliation specifically against Chinese companies. And so the way Chinese people view it is it's the United States just being a bully. And so that's a problem. That's a messaging problem that's separate from the actions themselves. And that'll be really unfortunate, because right now we do have a Washington-Beijing dialogue that's toxic. And at this point, that hasn't really affected, you know, brand America. I think brand America is still viewed as a very positive thing here in the Chinese market among consumers, in our employees and our friends and neighbors. And so that's an issue there. Specifically about Huawei, you know, in the entities list, and I don't know, there is a lot of discussion about, you know, is this the death knell for Huawei specifically? This type of action did actually could have strangled ZTE. But ZTE is a much weaker player, and so that was sort of brought to heel. Will the same thing happen on the Huawei side? I don't know, but I do know this. I think that don't count them out too quickly, meaning this is an extremely innovative market. It wouldn't surprise me to see Huawei and Huawei suppliers pivot and fill that gap. They won't do it by the time the inventory, I think inventory runs out on some of their US technologies. You know, I've heard various reports being mid-September, which is now, versus sort of Q1 of next year. Is that mean lights out for Huawei? I've seen China pivot faster before on things. And again, sort of remember all the different instances in which people have bet against China, right? If you go back to the 90s, that the non-performing loans were going to bring the banking system to its knees. Okay, well, that didn't happen. Fast forward to 2000s, the property market bubble was going to cause the Chinese economy to collapse. Well, that didn't happen either. People started betting against the renminbi and taking short positions. They lost. So there is a pattern of seeing when China is sort of backed up against the wall, they are able to achieve extraordinary things. So in the case of Huawei, boy, I wouldn't bet either way. But it does seem to be driving more and more decoupling.
Can I make two comments?
Please.
One was on the discussion on PCAOB and the other one on Huawei. So let's go back to the first one on the discussion. That point came up that it's about the auditors and the auditing papers. It's not about the auditors. It's not about the auditing papers. So if you think more fundamentally, you know, the capital markets in the US are the gold standard for the rest of the world. Even investors that don't like the US want to invest here. And the reason they invest in the US markets is because they trust the US markets. That trust has a broad governance structure around it. And having valid accounting and auditing is part of it. So that's one. And there really is no reason why the auditing standards should be changed or should be amended for any company, Chinese or otherwise, because that impacts the entire trust in the entire market. So it's not about the auditors. It's not about the auditing papers. It's about trust in the US capital markets. And on that basis, I think Congress is entirely justified in requiring all companies that want to list in the US and trade in the US to adhere to the same standards, the same accounting standard. It has to be a level playing field. It doesn't matter if you're a big Chinese company or if you're doing big business in China. If you want to have your stocks traded here, people have to trust that your valuation means something. So that's on the one point. The second one, maybe the more important one, we are talking about the constraints placed on Chinese technology companies. So, you know, this notion somehow that free trade is all good for all sides. This is complete nonsense that a lot of economists in the past have tried to move forward. And I can get into the details, but let me get specifically about Huawei. So I don't know how much you know about the software and the hardware that Huawei sells and other Chinese communications companies. So in China, every software and hardware company has to provide a restricted interface. So what that means is the Communist Party there has access to every piece of software and hardware that's developed in China and sold internationally. So what that means is they have access to every hardware that is done in China. And normally it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're looking at the Zoom, this Zoom platform or Zoom meeting, there's nothing. Who cares if you can watch this stuff? But think about, say you're having a public utility. You can do a lot of damage if you can get into their infrastructure through their software, or you are looking at a canal, or you're looking at a ship coming in and a bridge gets lowered at the wrong time. I mean, that could damage a lot of things. So one can do a lot of damage without firing a single shot if you allow this restricted access software and hardware to come to the US, or any country that accepts that can end up really undermining its security and safety in many serious ways. That's what it's about. And of course, there's a longer issue about national security in that. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your comments, Sanjay. I wanted to quickly, we're winding down here. I also wanted to thank Rima Tabak, who's here from Grant Thornton, and she is the general manager of their San Francisco office, but based in China. So Rima, I don't know if you had any other insights with this before I ask kind of the last round of lightning questions.
Well, I'm actually not based in China. I'm now based here, but I used to be based in China. Yeah, so I'm the office managing partner for the San Francisco office, and I used to do what Warren did right after me. He just completed his rotation. I just wanted to say one thing about what Sanjay said. There's no question, and we've been wanting this for years, that the Chinese government should allow for the PCAOB to come and inspect audit work papers. We all want to, make sure that it's the same standards, right? On the other hand, what the government has been saying is, well, if you can't let us in, then we will not allow for you to list in the US. And nobody has taken that seriously. It needs to be a serious threat, right? Because everybody understands that we need the Chinese capital invested in our market. So it's been this game for years now where one says one thing, the other one says another one, and it's not real threat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we're winding down. We just have a few minutes left. And so I thought what we could do for a last question to the three panelists, if each of you could give a very brief, your kind of top of mind thoughts on what you think is the most key things that directors should be dialoguing in the boardroom with regard to this topic. So we'll start where we started at the beginning. Harry?
So I think the discussion covered a lot of territory that is important for directors. And I think the question of compliance is paramount. And I think directors should not be shy in asking managers, executives of the companies that they oversee about what is going on in China, what are not just the risks and the opportunities that you face, but what steps are you actually taking? Oftentimes I find boards, take the cyber issue, I find boards of directors think it's too technical to get into that conversation. It's not. And if it is, then something's wrong with the way the dialogue is going. And on the other hand, the tech folks in the company say, oh, I can't talk to the directors, it's going to be too technical. Well, then we're not doing corporate governance correctly. And you got to find a common lexicon. And I just use that as one example. And I think China is obviously an extraordinarily complex place, but I think as Keir articulated quite well, and I was trying to say the same, is that the US does not speak with one voice. And so it's no mystery as to why China, and China is not alone, that other countries don't understand what the US is doing. And it's not germane to this particular administration. It's, it's part of the democratic tradition that we have. We wish it were easier, but I think that means that boards have to understand that, if you're sitting on the US board, you've got to figure out how to interpret as best as you can with respect to the companies that you're overseeing working in China, what might be US policy, knowing full well that we've got to be honest, that you say, this is the way that we operate.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Okay, great. Warren, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I would just focus on, I prefaced my earlier comments around what are the risks in China and not what are the rewards. But China is a huge market, and it's dynamic, it's challenging, it's competitive. But if you want to succeed as a global company, you have to have a China strategy. And while there are risks in China, the rewards there are fantastic as well. And I would just encourage everyone to take advantage of those opportunities with an understanding of the risks and be smart about it. But the rewards are worth the effort.
Thanks. And 30 seconds, Kerr.
Yeah, 30 seconds. If I had two things to say, I would say what Warren just said, and I would say it twice, because that's a really key point. I mean, the rewards are definitely worth it. I would say, in terms of things to watch out for at the board level, I'd go back to alignment. I think look at the broad trends, both in the United States and in China. Both of these societies are evolving and changing, and I think it's important to make sure that your business is aligned with the broad directions. And on that point, again, what most people are concerned about right now in the China market is the U.S.-China tensions, is the fact that our societies and our economies are moving in different directions, and that's a major concern to U.S. companies here in China. It's not, when we ask them, it's not about the economy, it's not about domestic competition, it's not about the regulatory environment. They're most concerned, 71% said my number one issue looking out 5 years is U.S.-China tensions.
Okay.
That's what's on my mind.
Okay, great. Well, we're out of time, but I want to sincerely thank our three panelists. What a powerhouse of information. I can't thank you enough for being here, and also for everyone joining. We have a survey. We love your feedback on the program, and we'll see you at the next one. Lisa, I don't know if you had any other, you're on mute. You're on mute, Lisa. Oh, well. Anyway, so.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have a number of other programs coming up that we hope you'll join us for as well. Please do join us. We really appreciate you being a part of our community. And thanks to you, Kim, too, for taking this on. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Analysts, stay on the line. We'll do a quick.
Okay. Is this when the gifts get